Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the paperback launch for Prison by Any Other Name. This event is co-sponsored by Truthout, Uncle Bobby's Bookstore, and the New Press. Thanks to Avisa Gallman from Uncle Bobby's for her work to help make this event possible. My name is Jay, and I'll be running the tech for tonight. A couple of housekeeping points. ASL interpretation and live captioning are available. I want to thank Jess and Jeremy, our ASL interpreters, and Mary, our live captioner, for helping to make this event accessible. To enable captions, click the CC button on the bottom of your screen, and to pose a question to the panelists, use the Q&A button. And now I'll introduce our panelists. Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law, and is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor in the Department of Sociology and University of Pennsylvania Law School. Her books include Fatal Invention, published by the New Press, Killing the Black Body, and the upcoming Torn Apart, out in April 2022 from Basic Books, and available for pre-order now. Dean Spade has been working to build queer and trans liberation based in racial and economic justice for the past 2 decades. He works as an associate professor at Seattle University School of Law. His books include Normal Life, Administrative Violence, Critical Trans Politics, and the Limits of Law, and the recently published Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. Maya Schenwar is editor-in-chief of Truthout. She is the co-author with Victoria Law of Prison by Any Other Name and the author of Locked Down, Locked Out. She is the co-editor of Who Do You Serve, Who Do You Protect? Police Violence and Resistance in the United States. And Victoria Law, finally, is a freelance journalist focused on issues of incarceration. She is Maya's co-author of Prison by Any Other Name. Her other books are Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, and Prisons Keep Us Safer, and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. And we're proud to announce that Maya and Vicky's book is now out in paperback with a new afterword by the authors. And you can purchase that book from Uncle Bobby's bookstore. And whether you do it at their wonderful bookstore in Philadelphia or on their bookshop site, which I will put into the chat here, that would be great. And you can also choose to buy an extra paperback to donate to Chicago Books to Women in Prison, which will mail the books to people incarcerated in women's prisons. And you can buy your copies from Uncle Bobby's and fill in the following address, and they will donate your book to a person incarcerated in a women's prison. So here's the address in the chat, and I'm just going to read it out loud as well. Chicago Books to Women in Prison, care of RFUMC 4511 North Hermitage Ave, Chicago, Illinois 60640. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maya and Vicky, and I hope that you all enjoy the event. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are thrilled to be virtually together. It's not as fun as being together, but what can we do? We are here to celebrate the launch of the paperback of Prison by Any Other Name. Before we start, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement. We're all in different places. I'm on traditional Lenape land, AKA Manhattan, which was taken by settler colonialists back in the 16th century under a really messed up treaty. So Prison by Any Other Name, Maya and I got this idea for the book back in 2015 when Obama was still president, and we thought we were going into an era of understanding that mass incarceration was bad, that we did not need to lock up 2.2 to 2.3 million people behind bars. But we were also seeing a disturbing rise in alternatives to prison that looked very much like prison. It was taking people out of their homes, away from their families, from their communities, and confining them against their will in some sort of other establishment or institution. And it also meant that many of our institutions that were supposed to be helpful were mimicking prisons and becoming kind of like prison light. And we'll be talking more about that later with Dr. Dorothy Roberts around the family regulation system, also known more popularly as the child welfare system. And some of these forms of prison life were being touted as care rather than confinement. So people were being involuntarily committed to psychiatric institutions or coerced into going into drug treatment centers in which they were locked in, or being put in other types of coercive programs. And all of these functioned under the rubric of helping people stay out of prison and caring for them and not confining them, without looking at all of the underlying causes as to why people were being criminalized, including the causes of white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, and classism that just runs deep through our country's history. So we wrote a book that looks at and challenges some of these very popularly touted forms of confinement, alternatives to incarceration, so that way we wouldn't fall into this trap of believing in and supporting reforms that ultimately make the carceral state larger and more powerful and end up with more institutions that we have to dismantle down the line.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Vicki. I'm Maya, and I'll do my land acknowledgement. I'm in Chicago, which is on the unceded land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as others such as the Miami and Ho-Chunk nations. I'm so excited to be joining all of you tonight, and really grateful that Vicki and I are here to chat with the amazing Dorothy Roberts and Dean Spade. And before we get started with our conversation, I'll talk a little bit about the afterword of Prison by Any Other Name, which is the addition to our book that's only in this new paperback edition. And this new afterword addresses the last year, which of course feels like 10 years or 100 years. So we talk about the pandemic. We talk about the uprisings in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and others. And we talk about the grassroots flowering of mutual aid efforts that really rose up to meet the needs of organizers, with bail funds, with millions of people whose lives were impacted by COVID as well. And all of these moves toward taking care of each other are manifestations of abolition. So that's something we really centered on as we were revising our book. And in the afterword, we talk about how during the pandemic, a whole lot of people who had never participated in organizing or in mutual aid or knew the words mutual aid dove into this work. People in cities and towns across the country started community response networks and neighborhood groups to meet people's immediate needs. So buying their neighbors' groceries, helping their neighbors get basic supplies. We write about how in Minnesota, medical students who were pulled off of their clinical rotations formed a babysitting service, a free babysitting service to provide childcare for people working in hospitals. We write about how here in Chicago, we saw the emergence of a group called Chicago Community Jail Support, mutual aid for people as they're being released from Cook County Jail. So providing things like phone calls and clothing and snacks and PPE. So these are just a few examples. But the point is, the past year showed us that massive numbers of people can and want to come together to support each other, and that our abolitionist world of care is actually possible. And in fact, one of the most powerful aspects of the movement to defund the police and defend Black lives has been its emphasis on meeting people's actual needs. So from the beginning of the uprisings, defund organizers expressed that the movement's goals were not only shrinking and eventually eliminating policing, but also building, imagining, creating the world that we want to live in, and imagining this world beyond white supremacy and prisons and racial capitalism and police. And so as we're thinking through all these things, of course, some mainstream conversations have twisted the message about reinvesting police funds in community programs. And I think this discussion that we're having tonight is very important in that regard, because it's crucial to frame what we mean when we're talking about shifting resources toward care and toward meeting people's needs. Because so often, and this is something that's a big theme in our book in general, measures that are masquerading as care are actually about coercion and control. So tonight we're going to look at some of these systems of coercion. And then we're also going to ask, what is care? And talk about some possibilities for what that can actually look like, which I think is an exciting conversation. And we're so thankful that you're here. So Vicki, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Maya. So first question for everyone, we envision this more as a discussion rather than people doing talking heads. In this moment, when a lot of conversations are happening around reinvestment or putting money into communities instead of policing, are there places we should think twice about reinvesting? Can each of you talk about one system or phenomenon that is being promoted as care, but is actually manifesting as coercion? Dorothy, Dean, do you want to start us off? You can thumb wrestle or flip a coin.
Okay, I'm happy to start off if that's okay. So first of all, I really want to thank you, Maya and Vicki and Uncle Bobby's for inviting me to participate in this great discussion. Thank you for your book. And thank you for the release of the new paperback version of it. It's so exciting, such an important book, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation. I'm in Philadelphia, which is on the land of the Lenape people. So I can talk more about this later, and you've already mentioned the so-called child welfare system or child protective services, foster care. They have all of these benevolent sounding names that seem as if this is a system that cares for and protects children. But actually, it is exactly the opposite. And it's one of those places where even some abolitionists have pointed to reinvest funds taken from the police and prisons. And so I've been very concerned that what is really a form of policing, of family policing, has been largely absent from demands to defund the police and abolish prisons. And some activists have even recommended transferring money and resources and authority from police departments to health and human services departments that handle child protection. And this ignores the way in which the family policing system surveils and monitors and regulates and represses Black, Indigenous, poor, and other marginalized communities in ways that are not only similar to, but deeply entangled with law enforcement systems. So diverting money and power to child protection agencies would result in even more state intrusion and coercion of people who live in Black and other marginalized communities. If we link 911 to the child abuse hotline, as some people have suggested, that's just going to lead to more child maltreatment allegations and investigations, which can lead to placing children in a very damaging foster care system, breaking up families, and even permanently severing children's ties with their caregiving family members. So even what seem like innocent, benign, helpful recommendations like deploying social workers or visiting nurses to conduct wellness checks or to help parents who have a newborn baby would probably end up in increased surveillance of families, because these service providers are mandated reporters. And once they get into the home, they have huge powers to investigate. And many think that they have to then report what they suspect as child neglect, which is usually just needs that a family has, to authorities who aren't going to do anything to actually meet the family's needs. They're going to disrupt the family in really damaging ways. So we have to be really careful not to support this system that goes by the name of child protection and child welfare, and recognize that the movement to defund the police and abolish prisons should also include abolishing family policing, and that there is a common vision of meeting human needs, preventing violence, caring for people, that the prison abolition movement and a new growing movement to abolish child welfare share. And that's the exciting, I think, part of this connection, entanglement between these types of carceral systems that seem like they're caring, but they're really not.
Thanks for that, Dorothy. You just always do that so perfectly. It's like so clear. Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. Grateful to be invited, and also to Uncle Bobby's for organizing, and so grateful for this book, Prison by Any Other Name, which I have been teaching since it came out on hardback, and so excited to teach it in paperback now. It's just like such essential reading, and it's so readable, and it's so well done. And I've used it in activist groups and I'm in that are trying to fight back against electronic home monitoring and so many other like key interventions that you all expose as what they are. And I'm calling in from Seattle, which is on Duwamish land. This question made me think about this project I did with some other people. I'm putting the link in the chat in case people are interested, which was like a group of people who are interested in disability justice, wanting to push back on exactly this, on how a lot of people who are like coming to realize, oh my God, the cops are terrible, and we try to solve all the problems with the cops, and the cops show up and hurt people who are in crisis. A lot of people go to, well, let's provide care instead, using models that center like social workers, for example. And people in disability communities already know, just as people who've been subjected to the family regulation system, that those people are just a different kind of cop, and that the mandatory services that those people can use as interventions become like a pathway for like endless surveillance and often like ultimately criminalization. So we copied the framework that Miriam Kaba had used years ago for her like police reforms to avoid, which was like a great like short article she wrote. And we said like, what are other reforms to avoid from a disability justice perspective? And a lot of them are about like things that are supposed to be care, but are actually like greater surveillance or intervention. And so what I want to add to this is just that like, I think we should be suspicious of any care that is in the form of mandatory services. Like the idea of mandatory services is like of course, like people need healing, like abs-fucking-lutely, you know, like, yes, we all want healing for our communities. We see trauma and distress as leading to violence and harm, but mandatory services are never the pathway to healing. And you guys do such a great job in your book talking about that in the drug treatment chapter, especially, like it's just so clear. But when I was thinking about the example, I was thinking about things I've learned from Andrea Ritchie, another abolitionist scholar activist, about how, you know, we've got this whole sort of monstrous apparatus that's emerged in recent years, supposedly to protect people from sex trafficking, but it actually criminalizes people who are engaged in sex trades very intensely, and it criminalizes a lot of youth in sex trades. And so advocates have shown that. And then the response has been like, okay, once we arrest those youth who are involved in the sex trades, we'll give them an alternative diversion pathway, which has a bunch of mandatory services, which people, of course, can't do or don't want to do, or which are inappropriate for them. And then they get like, you know, they're more criminalizable because they didn't finish whatever ridiculous program some prosecutor drafted for them, you know. So this, I think this is just a big question in all the work that's happening all over the country to defund the police and to close our municipal courts that just like devour low-income people. I think this is a big thing because for years now, prosecutors have tried to cover the criminal system with all these alternative courts and diversion programs that like sound good, that make you go to a bunch of classes once you get arrested, or make you get a certificate in something. And it's like, oh yes, anger management and parenting and budgeting. And it's all the same colonial mindset that if you are a person in crisis, there is something wrong with you and we need to correct you. And that, like, no healing or well-being can come from that. That is just a method and a technology of like a racist apparatus of controlling poor people. And so I think I'm seeing this a lot in like our local work in the Seattle area to try to defund the police and to get rid of the municipal court. Like, how can we just take all the bricks out that suck people in, including all these soft looking things like community court? And, you know, like there's this way in which, you know, people talk about those are actually net widening. They've just caused more people to be sucked up into the system. And we know what that system does. And it's facing a serious legitimacy crisis, thank God. And the question is, how do we not let it reestablish its legitimacy through these soft methods? And your book is such a tool for that.
Thank you so much, Dean and Dorothy. Yeah, all of that resonates so much with me. And here in Chicago also, we're seeing this kind of attraction to problem-solving courts. You know, it's not exactly the same as criminal court. It's problem-solving court, mental health court, drug court. And I think that this is kind of central to what we're trying to say in the book is, Dean, how you brought up, when we're talking about care, it's not about mandating, forcing, confining, controlling. We have to really separate that out. And one example of something that is consistently promoted as care is assisted outpatient treatment, AOT, for people who've been given certain mental health diagnoses. And these are involuntary programs. They're enforced by civil court, where a person with a certain diagnosis needs to follow a court-ordered treatment plan. And often that includes compulsory medication. So medication that a court is forcing you to take, losses of civil rights, compulsory drug testing or alcohol testing, surveillance. A lot of times that includes HIPAA violations and lots of other types of control. And for many years, activists and researchers have been really sounding an alarm about how racism is baked into this system, the psychiatric system and the court system. And in this case, they're kind of interlaced, that targets people for mandatory outpatient treatment. And Black people and other marginalized groups are much more likely to be put under this type of control. But it's gaining in popularity. So as you were saying, Dean, certain parts of the criminalization system are really being forced into this crisis of legitimacy, and other parts are expanding. And in 2016, there was a rush of funding for these types of mandated programs. after a bipartisan push in Congress that was supported by the American Psychiatric Association and a bunch of other big national mainstream mental health organizations. And these kinds of programs have been advocated by people across the political spectrum. It's one of those kind of points of unity that people like to talk about, because people point to, of course, it's always preferable to have community-based treatment instead of forcing people into psychiatric hospitals. And that's true. You don't want to be forcing people into psychiatric hospitals ever. But we need to think about our definitions of community and our definitions of treatment, and really what kind of community is on offer when a driving force is surveillance and control. And so these court-mandated outpatient programs aren't providing people with necessities like food or housing. They're not giving people what they need. And instead, they're forcing this prescribed set of requirements for what people should be doing with their bodies and minds. And there's all kinds of research, even by the system's own standards. These types of programs do not work. But I think beyond that, and maybe even more importantly, these court-mandated programs assume that when someone is diagnosed with a psychiatric or psychosocial disability, that is somehow an error in them that needs to be erased. And assisted outpatient treatment makes their erasure a condition of court. And in some cases, even a condition of staying out of jail. But so one of the people we interviewed for our book was the wonderful Liat Ben Moshe, who said when we interviewed her, disability and madness are ways of living in the world. They're not conditions to be eliminated. And that was kind of a focal point for our chapter on disability and mental health and coercion. And so we have to reject that framework that assumes that disability and madness must simply be eliminated. And on that note, I wanted to briefly mention one more element of this, which is that as part of these programs, psychiatric medication is often mandated. And this is something that the psychiatric survivor and scholar Eric Fabris actually called chemical incarceration. So this way in which you're forced to take medication against your will, and then it serves as another mechanism of control and confinement. And obviously, I'm not saying people shouldn't take medication if they want to. I personally am very grateful for medication. But what we're talking about here is a question of compulsion and coercion, and how systems that purport to simply support people and even heal people are complicit in that coercion.
I think we've covered, a whole bunch of ground. Do you want to move on to the next question for Dorothy?
Sure, I can move forward. So Dorothy, we pointed to your work a lot in Prison by Any Other Name. Thank you so much for doing all of it. And we pointed to it to talk about how the family regulation system is actually part of the prison industrial complex. And we're so grateful to have you here to talk about that some more. So we're wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the place of the family regulation system or the child welfare system inside these systems of policing and surveillance and just how all of that works.
Sure. And I'm just so struck by everything that Dean and you just said about mandatory services, because mandatory services are what the child welfare system offers to families in need. When a parent or other family caregiver is accused of child maltreatment, which usually means they just don't have the resources needed to care for their children or accused of not having them, the solution is not to provide the resources, but to literally give them a list of mandated so-called services, which I think is kind of Orwellian, to call them services when they're actually a list of mandated tasks that the caregivers have to do. And they're usually extremely hard to fulfill. And if they're not met, then that means that children can be taken away, or if they're already taken away, they stay in foster care. And the main reason why parents' so-called rights to their child, that's what it's called, but their legal relationship with their child, is severed, is simply because the parent or other family caregiver didn't fulfill all the tasks. And the tasks usually have to do with exactly what you were saying. There's something wrong with you. Your child didn't go to school enough, or didn't have adequate medical care, or you're unhoused, or you don't have adequate nutrition. It's your fault. Something's wrong with you. And therefore, we're going to mandate that you engage in these therapeutic tasks to prove that you're now fit to get your child back. That is exactly what the child welfare system, family regulation, family policing system is all about. So it should be seen as part of the carceral state, partly because it operates exactly like police and prisons. It's in the logic I just talked about, but also it operates in close collaboration, intimate entanglement with police officers, and also is a direct pathway to jail and prison. So it's not just like police, it is a form of policing. It is an essential part of the carceral regime. And in fact, because it's seen as, by many people, as benevolent, it expands the carceral state beyond what police would be legally able to do. Now, that's, of course, police break the law all the time and act violently and breach people's constitutional rights and all of that. But the legal constraints that are supposed to be on police officers don't even apply to social workers. And so they're able to engage in a vast range of investigations, and they have the power. They come into people's homes without a warrant. And sometimes they're accompanied by police officers who now have access to the home without a warrant. They have the power to take children away from their homes before they get any judicial approval for it. And that also gives police officers the ability to do that. So they work together to increase the violence and disruption and terror that the police by themselves could do. It expands carceral logics and violence. It's not at all a softer, gentler way. It makes the terror worse. And for many families, it's worse to have your kids taken from you than to spend time in jail. On top of it, it leads to jail. So let me also point out that the origins, the roots of the so-called child welfare system are the same as those of police and prison. So we can trace the history of family policing to the sale of enslaved African family members, tearing families apart during the slavery era, and then followed by the apprenticeship of emancipated Black children back to their former enslavers. In fact, in my book, Torn Apart, I say this is the original foster care system for Black children, was courts ordering Black children, because their parents were deemed neglectful. It's almost exactly what goes on today, but freed Black children, ordering them to work for their former enslavers as apprentices. That's the roots of our child welfare system, along with the systematic destruction and removal and transfer of Native children to boarding schools as part of the US war on Native nations. And then as well, the servitude of impoverished European immigrant children and putting them on orphan trains to go work on distant farms. So the history, like the history of prisons in the United States, is rooted in racial and class oppression and racial capitalism. If I can just say a few more things, I feel like I've been going on, but I want to point out one more way in which this is not at all a caring system, and that is the whole concept of foster care, and just how devious and deceitful that way of calling what the state does to children after they're taken from their families. This is a system that is set up to interfere with children's emotional and physical health. It moves them around, often to strangers' homes, and also often, especially for Black children, especially for LGBTQ children, and especially for teens, into what's called congregate care or group homes, where they're not like families at all. And many are put in what's called therapeutic. There's all these horrible euphemisms to obscure what's really going on, the violence that really goes on, but so-called therapeutic treatment centers, which is often where children where they can't find another placement, or children with mental health problems are put in these places that are really prisons. They are monitored by guards and there have been many recent cases of guards killing children in these horrible places. They criminalize children, children who run away from foster care because it's so damaging are criminalized. They are locked up in jail and juvenile detention centers. So I could go on, but let me just mention one more thing about one of the points that you make in Prison by Any Other Name about how reforms in foster care can lead to even greater surveillance. So, and this is an important point that links the need to abolish the child welfare system to abolitionist thinking about prisons and police and how reforms don't work. So one of the major reforms, because the foster care system is so overloaded and expensive, some legislators have sought to reform it by focusing on what they consider to be, the riskiest families, and then putting those kids in foster care, and then having another system, that's kinder and gentler, but you're still in the system. And so what happens, and this has happened in New York City, for example, that dramatically reduced its foster care population, but at the same time expanded the number of families that are under state surveillance through the child protection system. And once you're in that system, and by the way, half of all Black children in America, by the time they reach age 18, will have been investigated, been subjected to one of these investigations. Once you're in it, you are always at risk of a state agent coming in and taking your child away and putting the child in foster care. I could go on and on about the damaging impact of this system and the way in which it operates, just like and with police officers and prisons. But I'll leave it at that, so others can add to the distinction between care and coercion.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, for laying out the myriad ways in which we think of this system that's supposed to care about children really tearing families apart and not doing very much to actually protect children from harm and violence, and instead enacting even more violence and trauma on them. Shifting gears a little, we also want to think about what actual care could look like, since systems like policing and the family regulation system and these coercive mental health and drug treatment and alternative court systems actually aren't care. So Dean, we cited you in our paperback Afterward, A Prison by Any Other Name, talking about mutual aid. For those listeners, viewers who don't know, could you explain what mutual aid is and why this is important?
Yeah, I just have to say, like, while Dorothy was talking, I was having flashbacks to, we had this fight for like, I don't know, 8 years in Seattle to try to stop the county from building a new youth jail. And the youth jail, first of all, they framed it for the tax levy on the during the election as a youth and family services center. So people thought they were actually like voting for like something that would help youth and families. But of course, they're voting for a cage for children, new and improved. And then as the fight went on, and it was like a really powerful grassroots fight that really changed the political landscape here, even though they did build the jail. The county execs, like the mayor of the county, one of his moves was that he transferred the jail to the Department of Public Health. So it was like, oh no, this is a health intervention. Like, it's just literally the exact same jail that they're building. And they're like, oh no, but it's, and I just want to this stuff is just everywhere. But anyway, it's my own like stress about this thing I've lived through here. And I just want to say that when when everything popped off in 2020 with the rebellion, the first thing that guy announced was that he was going to close the jail in 5 years. It hadn't even been open for a year. Of course, we're going to have to fight like hell to actually make him close it. But it's like, what works? People burning down police stations. Like, that's what actually makes them close this. We did everything else before that, I mean, obviously it was building on the movement we've been doing, but I think it's useful to notice that disruption is what does get the goods in terms of forcing the hand of all of these expanders of these systems. Anyway, mutual aid, let's talk about the good news. So I think about mutual aid as a term used by a lot of people to mean a lot of things. I'll just say how I'm trying to use it, what criteria I think make it meaningful as mutual aid. Basically, it's like a term, of which there are many, for the part of social movement work that's about like when we actually help each other survive, like when we support each other with like our individual fights. And the two key things that make that mutual aid are, one, when we're saying, you know what, you're in crisis, you're not to blame, the system's to blame. Right, because charity always says like, oh no, you need an intervention, you need a parenting class, whatever. Right, so it's a kind of care work that says the system is to blame and not people in crisis. And the other thing is that it always comes with an invitation to collective action, because mutual aid is a part of a broader social movement ecosystem in which we're doing other things like trying to defund the police in our town, burning down the police station, trying to protesting outside the landlord's house, whatever it is we're all doing. And so mutual aid is just one piece of that, but that whole thing is about resistance. It's not about maintaining that system, which is what charity does. And mutual aid is really central to all movements. Like every movement that you see of anyone fighting for anything, what we're always doing in all those movements is also directly helping people right then. And that's just like very human and like ethical. It's like, of course, you're gonna like, if you want to like defund prisons and police and stop criminalization, you're also going to be directly supporting families of people who are currently criminalized and people who are in prison right now. And, all of the people who are in detention center and facing deportation, like doing court support for people who've been arrested, like that, all of that work is always part of those movements in the abolition movement and every other movement. But in the US, the narrative about social change tends to write out mutual aid. It's like, oh, some people made some speeches and some laws were passed. Does not how social change works. And so that's why it's important to be talking about mutual aid, is because mutual aid work is vital to building big movements. Most people who join social movements join because they encounter mutual aid. They're like, I need this thing, and like the government won't provide it, and I'm on the list of people who's not allowed to get it over here and over there. And this ragtag group in my town is providing it. And so I went there, and they said, you know what, it's not your fault. Everybody facing this is, this is being done by the government or by capitalists or whatever. And so I got fired up and joined the fight for all people like me, while I also got direct help with what was happening to me. Like, that's how people join movements and bring their wisdom about how the system works from their experience. And so mutual aid is like this vital on-ramp to political movements, which like basically, what we need is really big political movements with a lot of people participating, because our opposition has all of the money and the guns. They have the big militaries, they have all the tech. Like, all we have is the fact that most people on earth are not benefiting from these systems. So we have all the people. So we need to get all those people to actually participate with each other in what it would take to build an alternative world. So that's the last piece of it, is that, as you've all been saying, all the care systems that are in place that are supposed to keep us safe and well, like cops and borders and, all these horrible systems that are actually like making it impossible to breathe the air and drink the water, and also, squeezing people out of our communities and extracting our labor at very severe costs and caging our people, don't provide care, don't make us well. So what does? We actually do need ways to have childcare, to have healthcare, to have energy, and so mutual aid projects are where we are actually providing each other with all that stuff and figuring out practical solutions to real problems we have in our communities, like storms and fires and floods and, interpersonal violence and all these actual problems. And also mutual aid projects are places where we're practicing being the people who could live in that new world. So where we're like making decisions together and like trying to unlearn toxic masculinity and trying to figure out how to do disability justice in a group and trying to learn how to deal with conflict and give feedback, like all the things we would actually need to like survive based on cooperation and collaboration, not based on domination and extraction. So it's big in a lot of ways in terms of why it's important. It's important because right now people are getting stuff they wouldn't have without it, and that like the government's not going to provide. Like, a lot of mutual aid that happens is for all the people who are left out by existing government programs. Like, that's happening all the time. People who've been marked as disposable, who are not deserving, who can't get on a waiting list for housing or aren't going to get unemployment because their work was under the table or they're undocumented. I mean, so much mutual aid is about how this system is designed to fail most people. And so we need that. The urgency of that is clear. And it's also like this vital ingredient in building like the real solutions that we desperately need. I mean, the clock is ticking and the crises are just nonstop, as we all know. And I also just want to say, like, I think most people who become involved in mutual aid experience like deep learning and satisfaction. Like, oh, I'm actually doing something about what I'm angry at. That's not just a symbolic act or waiting to vote or clicking on something. I'm like participating with other people. I'm learning about myself. I'm making connections with people I wouldn't have otherwise known. Like, I think it's life-saving also in terms of breaking some of the isolation that's caused by the conditions we are living in right now.
Yay. Yeah, I was getting more hopeful just listening to that. Thank you. So, Vicky, in Prison by Any Other Name, we talk specifically about what care could look like in a bunch of different contexts. And a few of those are mental health, addiction, drug-related type harms, and also kind of the larger question of harm. And so I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of those contexts. And first, I would like you, if you're up for it, to talk about how care could be reimagined outside of policing entirely when it comes to mental health.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And thank you, Dean, for laying out what mutual aid is. And so one thing to think about is that when we're talking about what care could actually look like, what we're not saying is that we're going to have a replacement, like in the way that alternative courts, replace courts, traditional criminal courts, the way that this replaces that. So it's not going to be, I take this pencil, and I give you this pen and it's a 1-for-1 trade, it might look very different depending on the situation. So we're not going to give you a cookie cutter formula that you can follow by the T. But, you know, in talking about reimagining mental health care, I think we need to think about, like, what does the person need and what do they say that they need? So sometimes people need help and they go to the hospital or to the doctor seeking support, and then they end up being coerced into care that they do not find very caring or helpful, or they get locked up in psychiatric confinement. And they go to the doctor, the hospital, not to be locked up or penalized, but because that is the option that is available to them. When we were writing this book, we were interviewing various people, including people who had experienced being locked up, for experiencing mental health crises, for, you know, experiencing other, you know, madness and other ways of being. And they talked about building, you know, their own safety chain of friends, like after having gone through these coercive systems, knowing that they cause more harm and more violence. So Mia Mingus of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and I will put that in the chat after I finish talking because I can't do both at once, talks about this practice called pod mapping, in which basically, like, you look at who can help you in what situations and who is in your community, who is in your life that can help you when you have certain situations come up. It might be who can lend you $5. So, you know, you can, like, go to the store and get something, you know, that you really need because you don't have $5. Who can, if you are a caregiver for a small child, who can maybe take your child for a couple of hours so you don't lose your mind? You know, like, if you feel like you are at a point where you've been cooped up all day, every day, you know, during this pandemic, and you're like, I just need a respite. Who can, you know, take you to go get your medications if you need medications and the pharmacy is way on the other side of town? Who can help you do any of these things? And different people can play different roles. The person who can lend you $5 may never be available to take you to the pharmacy or to watch your kid, probably, and may not be the person that you want to go to talk through your feelings, because they might be like, I don't know about this feelings thing. You know, here's $5. You know, I have a good paying job, but, you know, this emotional labor is really not my thing. The person who can listen to you may never, ever have $5. So it's really important to be able to say, like, you know, who is there for me? And sometimes it's a learning process. You know, I might think, oh, I can always be there for somebody. And at some point I cannot, you know, because I'm busy. I have my own things going on. You know, maybe in that instance, I'm the person that can give you $5 to get to the store to go do something. But it's also building your own safety plan. What works for you and what doesn't. One of the people we interviewed, Elliot Fukui, who is part of the Fireweed Collective, and now talks about mental health and trauma and ways to deal with mental health crises outside of this system, talked about building his own safety chain of friends who could be supportive and know what to do and what not to do. And the way he does this is is that they all know each other and they're all in communication. So if he feels like he's approaching some sort of crisis, he can send one text to somebody who then activates the network of people. And this might be who is physically closest, who can get to his house, you know, and ascertain that everything is okay and see what his needs are, who might be able to do this role or that role or that role. But they also know what is not helpful, so that way they're not jumping to conclusions. And this is a plan that takes a while to make, and is a plan that, very importantly, is not made during a crisis when everybody is panicking and doesn't know what to do and everything seems super urgent. So it's building support networks, you know, it's also finding other support networks. We interviewed people from, you know, Icarus, the Icarus Project, which is now called the Fireweed Collective. We talk about the Hearing Voices Network, which Maya talked earlier about, not criminalizing or penalizing people for having different ways of being or existing, and finding those kinds of networks to help you build what you need. And then getting to know your neighbors, because people who don't know you, if you're acting what they think is erratically, might panic and do something that is not helpful, whether it's calling police, calling social workers, calling the hospital, when really what needs to be done is something very different. But if they don't know you, then they don't know how to react in that situation. And again, they go back to what they have always been taught, which is you pick up the phone and you dial 911. So Maya, what does care look like in the context of drug use?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that great response on the mental health front. So I think this is such an important thing to think about, especially right now when we have, in the midst of this skyrocketing overdose crisis, really so many bad answers being offered. We have people applauding Joe Biden for saying that instead of being arrested, everyone should be mandated to treatment. We have all of this advocacy for funding to go to treatment without even saying what it is. And I think that one thing we have to look at just from the get-go is that a very real side of this is recognizing that many people who are using drugs are actually not needing support in that area. Many people who are arrested for possessing or selling drugs are not needing support in that area. Their drug use is not a problem for them. And so just putting out there, and I think this is true for a lot of the criminalization system, that just because something is a crime, just because someone is arrested for something, doesn't mean that we then substitute in help instead of arresting them. Like sometimes you can just not arrest someone and let that be that. But obviously, you know, there are also a lot of people who are struggling. And when it comes to addressing and helping to prevent actual harm like overdoses, and for some people experiencing addiction that feels and looks like harm, I think there are a few directions that we can think about. And one thing, just on the policy level, is legalizing all drugs and having a safe supply of drugs that people can use. And that needs to happen in an equitable way that includes a whole range of reparations for communities that have been most impacted by the drug war, but it needs to happen. And for me, that long-term vision also includes ending criminalization of all kinds, not just drugs, because criminalization fuels trauma, which fuels things like overdose. And these things are very interconnected. So for me, it's not just end the drug war and then, you know, that's that. It's, the drug war is not like one narrow thing that has to do with drugs being criminalized. I think for more immediate solutions or options, we need to look at what's happening with grassroots mutual aid type harm reduction initiatives in places all around the country. So this is, again, this is already happening. It's just either not happening enough or not being permitted to happen enough. Very often, the things that are most helpful are not even legal. And very often, people who are involved in these grassroots initiatives use drugs themselves or have been drug users in the past. And I think we need to center folks who use drugs in these conversations. And one event that Vicki and I did last year was with the Steady Collective, which is a harm reduction collective in North Carolina. And one of the things that members of the collective were discussing is how even with harm reduction approaches that are very needed, like supervised consumption sites, which are also known as safe injection sites, this is a really important step that we need to take. We have to think about doing that work in ways that shun policing and surveillance. So you can't have police on the premises of the supervised consumption site. And also when it comes to distributing naloxone, which is something that needs to happen in a more widespread way, that's the life-saving overdose antidote, naloxone. We shouldn't be depending on training police to do that work. And instead, we should be training everybody. Like, why is this not a part of our basic first aid that so many of us learn when we have this overdose crisis that's real, that's happening? Why isn't something like so basic as an actual antidote being put in the hands of as many people as possible, as opposed to just police training? And also, there are simple steps, and neuroscience scientist, Dr. Carl Hart, who Vicki and I have both interviewed, and who has, I think, a lot of really important solutions that people should be looking at that are very straightforward. One of the things that Carl Hart mentions is drug checking. So offering people who use drugs help with just testing their drugs to see what's in them. Because very often when overdoses happen, it's not because someone takes too much pure heroin that they think they're taking. It's because that heroin has all kinds of things in it that they did not realize. And so offering that kind of safety testing universally and anonymously to anyone who wants it, that could be preventing thousands and thousands of deaths. So I think that we need to be simultaneously rejecting surveillance practices and embracing those kinds of strategies that support people's survival. And I'll just say quickly, I think that in relation to drugs and drug-related issues, fundamentally, care is not just about substances. It's not just about how do we prevent overdose directly, how do we support people through their addictions. We can't truly address addiction and overdose without reshaping our society in ways that ensure that everybody has non-coercive and equitable healthcare. Everybody has housing. Everybody has good food and childcare and some leisure time and all of these essential needs. So we can't be breaking off drug-related needs from humanity's needs. I think we are maybe gonna skip a couple things that we were gonna ask, because we've had so much powerful conversation and this event is only an hour and 15 minutes. But I did want to, let's see. Yeah, Vicki, do you want to maybe ask the question that you were going to ask next? We'll skip the things that you and I were going to talk about.
Sure.
Sorry for that unprofessional, weird.
We just turned. It's fine. We don't even have a cookie cutter formula that we can follow. So
No.
it's improvisation in action. So Dorothy, can you talk about what care actually looks like regarding families and supporting parents instead of this family regulation system that is currently in place?
Sure. Well, to put it simply, it would be the opposite of what the so-called child welfare system does now. So it would, first of all, not be based on the false logic that the main harms to children are caused by their family caregivers, and that the answer to harms to children is to just take them away from their families. So instead, it would address the structural inequities that are actually what harms children in our society and meet their needs and work to prevent violence in homes. So the very logic would change. completely. And then it would, and this is following up on what we've been talking about throughout the program, but it would be voluntary instead of coercive. So right now, as I was saying before, the solution that the family regulation system offers to families' needs is to mandate a set of usually irrelevant and unhelpful services that are just barriers to what the family actually needs, what would actually be care. So, and we know that coercive systems, as we've been saying, don't actually provide care. In fact, they interfere with the care that could be given. So they would have to be voluntary, no strings attached, no need to jump through hoops in order to get inadequate care. It would be completely voluntary. And then it would provide concrete material resources that families need rather than therapeutic remedies to cure supposed parental deficits. And so it's concrete and tangible, and it's what families say they need, not what some state agent makes up that they need. It would be community-based instead of being imposed by a state system. So as you were saying, I don't advocate, nor do others who are in this movement, another state system that provides care better. It wouldn't be a state system at all. It would be community-based mutual aid. And I advocate for state support, but it would be support like checks to families, added income, not with no strings attached at all. And this does not mean, some people say, well, you're just ignoring violence against children in the home. As I've already mentioned, the vast majority of cases of families involved in the family regulation system don't involve violence. They involve neglect related to just not having the means to buy the housing and food and medical care. But of course, there are cases of violence against children, but the child welfare system doesn't prevent violence at all. And so what care would mean is transformative justice approaches that actually examine the reasons for domestic violence and come up with community-based ways of holding people accountable and addressing the sources of violence in order to prevent it from happening again. Let me point out that there is a professor at NYU Law School, Anna Ahrens, who recently wrote a paper about an unintended abolition of the child welfare system in New York City during the lockdown, during the COVID pandemic. And she calls it an unintended abolition because the city's family policing apparatus basically shut down. There were far fewer reports. Caseworkers weren't going out to investigate children. The family courts shut down, except in really extreme cases. It basically wasn't operating anymore. And you might recall that there were all these newspaper articles saying, oh, children are going to be abused because we don't have our eyes in the home and they're trapped with their abusive parents and all of that. Well, in fact, there is absolutely no evidence of any increase. And in fact, there may have been a decrease in child maltreatment during that time. And the reason, Professor Aaron says, is because mutual aid networks sprang into action during the COVID lockdown and provided the kinds of material supports like groceries and diapers and childcare that families need. Some of the things that Vicki and Dean, you were all talking about. And the other thing was that families got checks in the mail, without having to jump through hoops, just added income. And so we know already what works to keep children safe and support families. And we need to end the family regulation system and policing that we have now, which will, as we're building a more caring society, but they have to happen at the same time. Because as I've been saying, the system we have now interferes with care. It's the opposite of care. And by shrinking it and creating mutual aid networks and transformative justice and some of what you all have been talking about, we can help people refuse to participate in this system, which presents itself as the only way of protecting children when it actually isn't. And so I join you in your efforts to build that society, and I believe we can do it as we dismantle this horrible, atrocious violence system that we have now. No mandated reporting also, that's part of it. No state deputized agents going around reporting on families, especially the people who are supposed to be providing services that are mandated reporters. It makes no sense. Abolish it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the things that people have been surprised by when they aren't mandated reporters themselves, when they read Prison by Any Other Name, is like, wait, teachers are mandated reporters, social workers, nurses, like all of these people who, of course, did not mostly get into those fields in order to do policing work are mandated reporters. And of course, in some states, everyone is a mandated reporter. So yeah, absolutely. So we are a little bit over time, but we were wondering, Dean, if you could quickly share an example of a mutual aid project that you're excited about. Obviously, this has been a summer of many, many massive crises that are environmental and Delta variant, and we're wondering if you could pick a project that is giving you hope.
Yeah, I just put 2 links in the chat that I hope people will look into. Jordan Flaherty just made a really short, really excellent documentary about mutual aid in the face of Ida. And there's also a link I shared about people who are doing ongoing work since Hurricane Harvey in Houston. And both of these pieces just give you a sense of what it is. And I'm not going to like name a specific project because so much of what's happening is like unnamed, just like people organizing the streets, and like a lot of mutual aid projects come and go. People keep fixing each other's ceilings, keep figuring out a way to put a generator in the house of somebody who's really going to need it if the lights go out for their medical devices, keep figuring out how to distribute food. And I really encourage people to just find these things where you live. They are everywhere. And one other type of mutual aid that I think is really important for us to build and grow right now is defending encampments of unhoused people against police sweeps. And people are doing that. I mean, so many groups, Stop the Sweeps here in Seattle, Street Watch LA. I mean, so many different groups are doing this. And so far, people aren't usually winning those battles. Like people gather to stop a sweep, and then the city spends millions of dollars to come and clear people's stuff. So what would it look like if we started to win? How many of us would have to show up to every sweep to prevent people from losing all their belongings, being shuttled to another part of the city where they'll be living supposedly illegally under these unjust laws? So I really want to like help people both see what kind of stuff is happening and figure out like, how do we do it now? And a lot of these groups are also doing disaster preparedness, like people in Houston who already went through Harvey, doing disaster preparedness workshops, knowing that the next storm, the next fire, the next winter storm, it's all coming to wherever you live. So what does it take to do preparedness before the next one? And so I just hope people look at these resources as ways of thinking that through, because it's no matter where you live, something is on the horizon.
Thank you so much, Dean. I know we're like at time, but I want to squeeze in at least one practical question. We have a whole bunch in the Q&A. Thank you for being with us. This question is from someone who is a former public school teacher and now is a licensed foster parent. And she writes, they write, I often question my decision to partake in school and the foster care system. I then go back to thinking about the kids that I've been blessed to serve in my home and how I wouldn't be able to do that in the same way with being part of a larger village and having kids live with me temporarily. And their question is, they wanted to ask how to serve within their role, alternative methods to legally house a child, etc., and or how to reconcile the work that they do when interacting with these systems. And this seems like a very practical, note to kind of close up the what is care and what is coercion. So thoughts? I turn to you, Dorothy Roberts, as perhaps the expert, but we can also all chime in later.
I am not an expert in answering questions like this. I think this question that we all have to grapple with, because we all are involved, are touched by in some way these carceral systems. And we have to, if anyone in academia, is, I am, Dean is, how do we act for liberation within these systems? Some of us more involved than others. Some of us make the decision, I would never be involved in a system like that. And I get this question from social workers, from people like the person who's asking the question about being a foster parent. What do I do? So I don't, it's partly because we don't have a lot of time. I don't want to say quit now. There are some jobs I would say quit now, but I think that this is something that's really important for abolitionists to confront. What about people who are involved in some way in these systems? Is there any role for them to play? And I'm not talking about prison guards. I'm talking about social workers who are trying to assist families. I'm talking about someone like this, a foster parent. And one answer is to get out of the system. This system is not designed to provide or protect or care. And one answer absolutely is, if I'm a social worker, I'm going to work in a community-based mutual aid role, or I'm going to work in a family defender's office to protect the rights of families that are being disrupted, and figure out ways to keep the state out of the family's life so that they can take advantage of community-based mutual aid supports instead. Or a foster parent who says, I'm not going to participate in the foster care system because it is a damaging system. Even if you are trying your best to care for children, find other ways. I think Dean and Maya and Vicky, we've all talked about other ways that you can care or help care for, create more caring communities that don't involve being connected to one of these carceral systems. And so, if I was concerned about a child whose family was struggling, I would figure out how to, collectively in my community, help that family with its struggles, rather than be part of a system whose answer is to take the child away from the family. And so I don't know who asked the question. I really feel that I don't want to give specific advice to someone I don't know or know what their situation is, but rather than be involved in the formal foster care system, I would say look for ways, as Jean just pointed out, there are ways all around you. And let me use this as an opportunity to also mention that families, and this is youth and parents and other family caregivers who have been impacted, disrupted, terrorized by the system, have been coming together. In fact, I thought of this when Dean said, this is an entree, mutual aid is an entree into movements. For many of these families, their entree into abolitionist organizing against the system was coming together to support each other. That's how they got involved. And so find these communities, these collectives of people who are coming together to support each other. That to me is the best way to care for a family or a child who's in need, not to get involved in a system whose design and goal is to destroy families and to pretend that the answer to families' needs and children's needs and safety is to take children away from their families and blame their parents for the harms that this society inflicts on children. You know, I realize that this requires, you know, a deeper conversation, but those are just some of my initial thoughts, not knowing the particular situation that the person asking the question is in.
I so appreciate what you just shared, Dorothy. And I just want to add, there is something really interesting happening in some of the defund work that has surprised me, where like what we've seen in some of these conversations is it'll be like these social workers who are really involved in this project that centered police, they actually all want out of that. And then when the defund work starts happening in their city, they actually join our side and are like, yeah, we can propose to do this without the cops. Or the people who work in probation actually would all much rather be help people get jobs without the criminal system hanging over them. And a lot of those workforces are people who are from criminalized communities. So I am kind of curious, like, how can people who are in those jobs become really vocal advocates and pragmatic problem solvers and become the workers potentially in different systems that might emerge that don't have that aren't tied to policing their criminal system? I think there are some strategic opportunities there. The other thing I would say, just to echo Dorothy, is like, you know, there's so many people who fall through the cracks. Like you know, one place where I've seen this is people doing informal networks to house people who age out of foster care into homelessness, or people who come out of the prison system into homelessness. So if we get together in our community and start a Google Doc about like who has a basement room that they could give for 2 weeks and who has a guest room they could give for a month, and who's willing to write into the prison system and say, I will house this person when they get out. Like we need so much more of that. And that is all ways we can just similarly be like directly supporting youth, directly supporting vulnerable people, not necessarily through the system. So I just wanted to offer those two ideas.
And I just want to jump in, and this is like a more modest, like what you can do starting today or tomorrow morning when you wake up, or, you know, like if you are currently a foster parent, is look at it as you're trying to figure out how to re-envision your role or take yourself out of that role. You can also do harm reduction while you are still in that role. I mean, again and again and again, we talked to parents, you know, parents who are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, parents who were entangled in the family regulation system with, you know, for our book and for other pieces that we've written, where they talk about, you know, the foster parent not making it easy for them to be connected to their child. So, you know, you don't make it difficult for families to connect, you know, listen to what the child says they need. You know, like the child says, I want my mommy. It's like, listen to that, you know, but also listen to like what else they're saying. And I mean, I also speak from the experience of, you know, having friends who were in the foster care system, you know, during that time. And some of them did come from homes that were violent and abusive. They did not want to be thrown in this other system but it's sort of like, here are your two options. Like your parents are violent and abusive, and now you get put in this impersonal system in which you are somehow punished, for being in this family. So listen to what that child needs and figure out like how to support that child through what they need for healing. Don't just be like, I'm just going to have you for 6 months and then you're going to get shuffled along to the next place. So these are like small things that like this person can do, and anybody who's currently a foster parent can do tonight, tomorrow, the next day, while they're also trying to reimagine how to exit that system and perhaps play a more meaningful role in supporting families and communities.
Thank you so much, everyone. Such great responses. I want to mention one little project and then close out. In thinking about that idea of people in roles that are complicit with the system and how things have shifted during defund, one inspiring project that I've interacted with is this group called Social Service Workers United Chicago. And these are abolitionist social service workers who are trying to fundamentally challenge the field of social work, not saying, oh, we should improve this or improve that, but saying the entire framework of this type of work has to change. And last year, they sent a petition with a ton of signatures to the National Association of Social Workers, demanding that the association take real action to support abolition. They run a direct practice group, so workers are coming together to develop radical anti-capitalist practices that actually challenge the frameworks of traditional social work, including its hierarchical nature, right? Which is one of the things I think we've been talking about a lot today, is like, well, if you have a profession that's just inherently hierarchical, that's something that you want to challenge. One of the organizers that's involved in this group, Elena Gormley, as well as some other social work students and other supporters, actually created a guide called Alternatives to Calling DCFS, which in Illinois, that's Child Protective Services. And so this is saying, instead of reporting to DCFS, you can actually refuse. You can be a refuser inside of that system. And there are a whole lot of things that you can do that are not surveillance that can actually support families. And that just because you're inside that system does not mean that you have to make that choice. And you can be kind of like a conscientious objector while you're still in it, you know? So yeah, unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap up. Thank you to those who stayed with us for that extra 15 minutes. Really, really appreciate it. And I hope that people heard something today that sparked something for you, that helped you start asking questions around the idea of care. I hope that people will take the message that I think everyone brought here today, which is that there are things going on in your community that you can plug into and go out and look for those things. So yeah, I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much, everyone. If folks want to get off mute, panelists, and say a farewell, that'd be great.
Thank you. Thanks to the organizers.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Uncle Bobby.
Yes,
Thanks,
thanks,
New
Uncle
Press.
Bobby.
Yeah, and thank you to our interpreters and captains.
Yes, thank you.